everybody, it's Tim and welcome to the show. And I've got something very special planned for us. This is my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. And today we're going to look into a guy that was what the Beach Boys were to the beach in California music. And I think the same can be said of Bob Seger when it comes to Michigan and Midwestern rock and roll. He was the very epitome of the working class local hero who finally broke through and made it big. To me, Bob Seger is the very story of the tortoise and the hare. And what it proves is that you need more than just talent to make it in this business. You need persistence. And if nothing else, Bob Seger is a very persistent man. All right, let's get started. We're about 40 miles west of Detroit in Ann Arbor, Michigan on Main Street. And this college town is the home to the University of Michigan. And Bob Seger's family moved here when he was just 6. By the time Bob was 10, his father had left to start a music career, oddly enough, on the West Coast. And he never returned. And he left Bob's mother and his older brother George to fend for themselves. They had to scramble to make ends meet, and this left young Bob to make his way in the world without any parental limitations whatsoever. He was free to do what he pleased, and what he pleased to do was music. Now, just around the corner here is Ann Street, and these gentrified rows of art galleries sit on what was formerly the most notorious section of Ann Arbor. It was known by the police as the Block, and there was the Derby Club right there. And then there was Clint's Club right here. There were row after row of these seedy pool halls and blues clubs, and as a young kid of 11 or 12, Bob used to sneak out and stand for hours outside the windows here listening to blues bands like Washboard Willie and watching girls dance through the window here. And he had what he described as an awakening here, and he would recall these places many times in songs like Main Street and Night Moves. Right here, the former Clint's Club. Bob had grown up playing ukulele, but when rock and roll came a-calling, the ukulele just didn't cut it. By junior high, he had put together a doo-wop group called the Decibels, but when a friend named... the Decibels. And they would play, the local parties at the library, things like that. Bob's always had that distinctive style that lies somewhere between James Brown and Van Morrison. And he's always been into the rhythm and blues thing, so he got people on the dance floor. But what he had that nobody else had, even back then, was that voice. It's also where he started writing songs, most notably The Lonely One, of which very few copies were made on acetate disc. And it's become the rarest of rare Bob Seger recordings. He made his way through high school playing gigs and working at a clothing store and delivering pizzas from right here at the still thriving Brown Jug. And I know all about it because it was my day job as a struggling young musician too. Bob was doing whatever he could to contribute to his family, and I think that work ethic is something that would sustain him in later years when the going got tough. And he himself has said that his philosophy is expect the worst and hope for the best. And I don't know about you, but I could totally relate to that. All right, let's get on to our next one. Back in Bob's high school days, friends liked having him around for what they called Seger luck. He was the only one among them who had never been busted for minor in possession of alcohol. And if he was with you, you were deemed safe to bomb around Ann Arbor drinking beers in a car with your teenage hoodlum friends. Even still on the outskirts of Ann Arbor here, there's a lot of empty farmland. And back in the day off of Zeeb Road right here, Bob and his friends used to gather and have what they called grassers. And a grasser was the local vernacular for having a party in the pastures around Zeeb Road here. But they would listen to music and drink and dance, and by the end of the night pair off and steal away into the trusty woods or the back seat of a '60 Chevy. But it was these fields and these grassers that served as the impetus for some of Bob's biggest hits, like Night Moves, for instance. But right here, off Zeeb Road, the grassers. 1964, Bob formed a new band called the Town Criers, and they would play at local bowling alleys like the Huron Bowl, but they also did a lot of frat parties, and as a matter of fact, they played right on the steps here at the Chi Phi fraternity here at the University of Michigan. In 1965, Bob would join the popular Doug Brown and the Omens as the organ player and would handle vocals on the R&B numbers they did. And the Omens were a working band. They played 6 nights a week, 5 sets a night, often at the seediest of strip clubs. And it would also prove the catalyst for Bob meeting the only business partner he would ever have or ever need, Punch Andrews. High five. After high school, Bob Seger worked for 4.5 years, 6 nights a week, 5 sets a night, before he was able to make his first record, which brings us here to United Sound Systems. So we're right across the interstate from Wayne State University there, and it's really remarkable that this place remains at all because they were widening the freeway a few years ago and they were going to demolish the place, but some good people here in Detroit worked to save it. And as you can see by the sign right here, it has a pretty impressive pedigree. This is where Bob's early recordings were made, things like East Side Story and I believe Heavy Music, but I want to take a minute to talk about East Side Story because it's really the missile that launched his career. While he was still with Doug Brown and the Omens, Punch Andrews asked Bob to write a song for one of his other bands, the Underdogs, who were the first white band to be signed to Motown Records subsidiary, VIP. By the way, where does that door go to? The song turned out to be East Side Story, but Punch Andrews hated the way the Underdogs did it, so Bob recorded his own version here and released it on Punch's local Hideout Records in June of 1966. And what happened next was fairly unprecedented for a local band, which is going to take us to our next location, so let's check it out. East Side Story is a bit of an anomaly among mid-60s garage band rock. Its lyrics are very different than anything on the radio at the time. The song deals with a young criminal and his inner city death, and although it's firmly ensconced in the rock genre, Bob's vocal delivery on it is very R&B. So this is the Detroit waterfront right here, and that right there would be Windsor, Canada. And it played a very significant role in making Bob Seger and company bona fide local legends. The song started racing up the charts, and it was helped greatly by a very popular afternoon show here in Detroit that was taped live right across the river there in Windsor, and it was called Robin Seymour's Swingin' Time. Robin Seymour was the Swingin' Time host, and he was a DJ on a very powerful Canadian station called CKLW, and would spin records every afternoon while kids danced and would have live guests come on and lip sync their latest releases. And because of its proximity to Detroit here, there was a fairly constant flow of Motown artists, people like Little Stevie Wonder, Martha and the Vandellas, the Temptations, that would come on the show and debut their newest single. But they would also sometimes have more unknown bands, even unsigned bands, and local bands like Bob Seger and the Last Herd. But being such a huge local hit was a bit of a double-edged sword. Hideout Records didn't have national distribution, so they did a deal with a Philadelphia company called Cameo Parkway Records, and it would later prove to be an utter disaster. Anyways, Windsor, Canada, right there. Before Punch Andrews became Bob Seger's manager, he operated a string of 14 clubs in the Detroit area called the Hideout, which basically ran from 1964 to 1968. So we're on Detroit's east side in Harper Woods. We're just adjacent to Grosse Pointe, actually. And this used to be the home to, I think, the original Hideout. It was called the Harper Hideout, and it was a VFW hall that Andrews would rent out mainly on Fridays. bands like the Underdogs, the Pleasure Seekers featuring Susie Quattro, and Glenn Frey's The Mushrooms. And of course, Bob would play here all the time. But after East Side Story, they put out a succession of locally successful singles like Sock It to Me Santa and Persecution Smith, until in 1967 when he recorded what I think is one of his best records ever, Heavy Music. Heavy Music is one of those songs that just demands that you move your body. The bass line, the beat, and most importantly, the vocal delivery, which I think went one step beyond Wilson Pickett, and it's what created the initial resistance on radio to the song. Heavy Music did well with its usual suspects in Michigan, but national radio seemed to have a problem with Bob screaming, going deeper, and I think they thought it was some kind of sexual reference. Go figure. Nevertheless, the song was ready to break nationally when Cameo Parkway Records unexpectedly folded, and in a long line of bad breaks, the song stalled and Bob Seger was back to square one. So much for the Seger luck, as they called it before. But right here, the Harper Hideout. So after the Heavy Music debacle, Bob Seger was offered a record deal with Motown Records, but Punch Andrews decided to decline it and sign with Capitol instead. He thought it was a better fit, and they became the Bob Seger system. They commenced to recording an album including the fine anti-war song 2+2 and the mind-blowingly great Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. So this is now called Disc Studios here on Detroit's East Side. And it used to be GM Studios, and Bob Seger recorded here quite a bit, all the way up to Night Moves, really, and I'm really glad to see that it's still in operation. There's a pretty cool story about recording Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. Bob had befriended a teenage Glenn Frey and had invited him down to the recording session to play acoustic guitar and sing some backgrounds. And by the way, if you listen to the song, you don't even have to listen to it closely. Glenn Frey is the loudest voice in the mix when it comes up to Ramblin' Man chorus. The song reached number 17 nationally, and it seemed that the then 23-year-old Bob Seger would finally make it over the hump. But some things are made to wait, and Bob would have to wait yet again for his big break. The follow-up to Ramblin' Gamblin' Man was the underwhelming and very, very puzzling album Noah. Not only did the Bob Seger system now have a co-lead singer, but Bob only ended up writing a couple songs on it. It was bizarre, to say the least, and Bob claims he was quitting music to go to college, and the record company had used his name to put an album out. A few months later, he came back, and I might add with no college degree, and he went on to record things like Mongrel and Lucifer and back in 72 and 7, all really great albums with songs like Get Out of Denver and Turn the Page, which in my humble opinion is still the most truthful and greatest song about being on tour that's ever been written. But right here, Disc Limited now, the former GM Studio. One of the anomalies about Bob Seger, and I think one of the signs of what a loyal guy he is his long-standing history with manager and co-producer Punch Andrews. They've been working together for over 60 years, and here in Birmingham, Michigan on Old Woodward Avenue used to be the base of their operations in the 70s. By 1974, Bob was on the road constantly, driving to over 250 dates a year, and it didn't seem to be getting him anywhere. And outside of Michigan and Florida, he was just popular enough to headline bars, but not enough to play small arenas or even theaters. And as Bob was fond of saying, for those first 8 years, I was more of a driver than a musician. And he was still no more than a local hero, and he knew he'd have to make a change, take more charge of his career, and do something different, and something different would happen on his next record. Right here, the old offices of Punch Andrews and Bob Seger. By the time he was working on his next album, which was to become Beautiful Loser, old friend Glenn Frey had become a star with the Eagles, and Bob would sometimes play him and Don Henley's songs he was working on to get their feedback. The song Beautiful Loser is about someone who always puts others ahead of his own best interests, always willing to be second best, as he says in the song. And to this day, Bob Seger swears it's not autobiographical. So he just wasn't sure about the tone of the song, but after hearing it, Glenn Frey was so impressed that he insisted Bob go on with the vibe and make a more diverse album than he had ever had in the past. The interesting thing about the Beautiful Loser album was that although a couple of the rockers were cut with the Silver Bullet Band, the bulk of it, including Beautiful Loser, were cut in Muscle Shoals, Alabama with the legendary Swampers, and it would be a formula that Bob would start using from then on. And I think part of it was that when he went down there, he was unburdened with telling musicians what to play and worrying about the technical side of things. The guys there were pros and interpreted music all day, every day, and he could trust the fact that at the very least it would sound as good as the Staple Singers or Wilson Pickett. And in a move that I'm sure they're still kicking themselves over, Warner Brothers Records rejected the album, and it ended up being picked up by Capitol Records. And in another stroke of luck, he landed a tour opening for Kiss, and with songs like Kathmandu, which by the way is another song that sounds pretty damn biographical to me, it slowly but surely rose up the charts, and it would pave the way for his next album, which would prove to be the ultimate breakthrough in Bob Seger's career. So as you can see, this is Huntington Place, and it used to be where Cobo Hall was. And in the 70s, Cobo Hall was the biggest arena that you could play, at least in southern Michigan, if not the entire Midwest. And it's where Bob Seger's long journey would finally pay off in a couple of concerts he did here. And on a personal note, I was lucky enough to witness one of them, and it was the last concert I saw before making my move out to Los Angeles in California. In September of '75, he recorded the two-night concert and released it as Live Bullet, and the world finally caught up to what we Michiganders knew all along. Bob Seger is a national treasure. The floodgates opened, and Bob had a pretty unprecedented string of hits, not least among them Night Moves and Main Street, which were songs about his spent youth in the streets and fields of Ann Arbor and Detroit. And he would often call upon his struggles to the top in many of his later works. He has since sold over 50 million albums and has the #1 jukebox selection of all time, which was Old Time Rock and Roll, and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004. And I think it would be very safe to say that he has been a major influence on any rocker that's emerged out of the Detroit area, or the Midwest for that matter, over the past 60 years. You know, I think possibly the thing Bob Seger should be proudest of is the way he's represented Detroit and Michigan. While other rockers have bailed on Detroit after their success, Bob Seger remains synonymous with the city, and you can often see him at Piston games or Lions games. He is class personified. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for us here, and I want to thank you for hanging out with us here in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. If you haven't done it already, now's the time where I would shamelessly ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. And we've got a pretty cool back catalog. If you like classic rock, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at it. Anyways, again, for Tim, thanks so much for hanging out with us. Let's be kind to one another. Peace out. Bye-bye.